Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. I'm a dark web chef that cooks death row, inmates their last meal. I always add in a secret ingredient. Hey everyone, I don't even know if I should be posting this here, but I've seen some crazy stuff in this subreddit before, so I guess this is as good a place as any. I've been holding on to this for a long time, and I feel like I need to get it off my chest. Call me insane, call me a liar. Honestly, I wouldn't blame you. But if you've got a moment, hear me out. A few years ago, I had a pretty ordinary life. Nothing to write home about. I was a line cook at a greasy diner on the outskirts of town. One of those places where the hash browns always taste like motor oil and the coffee is burnt half the time. I wasn't a great chef, but I got by. Then one night, a buddy of mine from the kitchen showed me something that changed everything. He pulled me aside after our shift, looking like he had a secret he couldn't wait to spill. "Ever heard of the deep web?" he asked. And when I said yeah, he got this wild grin on his face. He whipped out his phone, and I saw he had this Tor browser pulled up. He started showing me all these weird sites. Nothing too messed up, just forums and sketchy marketplaces, stuff like that. But then he showed me a job listing. It was written in a way that felt off, like it was trying too hard to be innocent. The title was Cooking Specialist Needed for Remote Work. "Think you got what it takes, chef," my buddy joked, but I could see he was only half kidding. I brushed it off, but that ad stuck with me. It paid in Bitcoin, more money than I'd ever seen for the kind of work I was doing. I tried to ignore it, but one night, after a particularly bad shift, where a customer screamed at me over cold eggs, I found myself digging through the deep web on my own. I found the listing again, and against my better judgment, I applied. It wasn't long before I got a reply, and whoever it was didn't waste time with pleasantries. The message was cold, clinical. They wanted me to prepare meals for clients in remote locations. No questions asked, no personal details exchanged. They assured me everything was legal, in a way. All I had to do was make the food, and I'd get paid. It felt shady, sure, but the money they offered made it hard to think straight. I figured it couldn't hurt to just test the waters, right? Maybe it was just some eccentric rich guy who liked to roleplay. But deep down, I knew there was something darker here. Curiosity got the better of me, and I accepted. They sent me a shipping address and instructions for the first meal. A medium rare steak, mashed potatoes, and a side of buttered green beans. It seemed so specific, but I didn't question it. I cooked it up like they asked, packed it in this thermal container they provided, and shipped it off. 2 days later, I got a message. Payment received. Excellent work. Another assignment awaits. It felt like a thrill, honestly. I'd always dreamed of being a private chef, and even though this wasn't what I had in mind, it felt like I'd finally found a niche. But then, the next message came with a note that I couldn't ignore. Client is on death row. Execution set for the day after the meal is delivered. My hands went cold when I read that. Was this some kind of joke? But no, the details were too precise. The instructions, the timeline, it all lined up too perfectly. They even attached a document that looked like some sort of internal prison file, listing the inmate's name and crime. This guy had been convicted for murder, and I was supposed to cook his last meal. I almost backed out right then, but then I saw the payout. twice as much as before. That kind of money could change things for me. Pay off debts, get out of that awful diner for good. So I pushed down the nerves and got to work. This time, they asked for fried chicken, mac and cheese, and collard greens. Something about it felt twisted, knowing this would be the last thing the guy ever ate, but I tried to shut that part of my brain off. I just focused on getting everything perfect. But as I cooked, this weird idea popped into my head. I remembered something my grandma used to tell me about putting a little piece of yourself into your cooking, like a lock of hair or a drop of blood, to make sure the food had your spirit in it. It was some old folklore thing. I never believed it, but for some reason, I couldn't get it out of my head. So, without really thinking it through, I pricked my finger with a kitchen knife, letting a drop of blood fall into the batter for the chicken. It was a tiny, stupid thing, but it made me feel like I had control over something in this weird situation. I fried up the chicken, packed everything, and shipped it off, just like before. A few days later, I got my payment, but this time, the message was different. It was just one word, approved. And then, a new job offer came through. Another last meal request. Another death row inmate. This one wanted lasagna. The pay was even higher. I told myself that if I did just one more, I'd walk away. But now I can't shake the feeling that I got in too deep. There's something about those messages, about how specific and clinical they are. Like there's something watching every move I make, waiting to see if I'll slip up. And that stupid thing I did with the blood, ever since then, I feel like I've been drawn deeper into this. Whatever this is, I keep telling myself it's just my imagination, that I'm still the one in control. But that's a lie, isn't it? I'm starting to think they never planned to let me walk away. The lasagna order was just the beginning. The requests started coming in faster, each one more specific than the last. It wasn't just about the food anymore. It was about the process, the atmosphere. One time, they wanted me to play classical music while cooking. Another time, they asked for all the lights in my kitchen to be off, except one candle. And every time, the payment was higher, enough to keep me hooked. But I started noticing small, unsettling details. Like how, after I shipped off the lasagna, the guy's photo and file vanished from the web, as if he'd never existed. And then, there were the messages. They got more personal. Whoever was on the other end knew things about me. Not just my cooking style, but stuff I'd never told anyone. Things like the scar on my left hand from a childhood accident, or the fact that I sleep with the TV on because I can't stand total silence. I should have walked away, blocked all contact, changed my address. But the money kept coming, and my greed kept me in the game. I convinced myself that they couldn't possibly know where I lived. After all, I was careful with my shipping details. But then, one night, I came home to find a package waiting at my doorstep. No return address, no label, just a plain black box tied with twine. I almost didn't open it. My hand shook as I fumbled with the twine, feeling this horrible dread twist in my gut. Inside was a small silver spoon, the kind you'd see in a fancy restaurant. It was engraved with a date, July 19th, 2005. That date hit me like a punch to the gut. It was the day my mom died. A car crash. I was 12. There's no way they could have known that. I threw the spoon across the room, and it clattered on the floor, the noise echoing in my tiny apartment. My mind raced. Who the hell were these people? Why were they playing games with me? But even after all that, I still couldn't resist opening the next message they sent. It was shorter than usual, almost casual, like they were talking to an old friend. We hope you liked our gift. This time, we like something special. Spaghetti carbonara. And don't forget your secret ingredient. It's become our favorite touch. My blood ran cold. They knew. They knew about the drop of blood. I'd never told them, never mentioned it in my reports or messages. Hell, it was just a weird little ritual, something I thought would make me feel in control, but now it felt like a trap I'd walked straight into. I tried to ignore it, but that voice in my head, the one that kept saying, "Just one more job and you're out," won again. I made the carbonara, shaking the entire time. When it came time to add the secret ingredient, I hesitated, holding the knife over my finger. But then I thought about the money, the bills piling up, and that feeling that maybe this time, if I did everything just right, they'd let me go. I pricked my finger and let a drop of blood fall into the sauce. As it swirled into the creamy mix, a strange calm washed over me, like I was stepping deeper into the darkness on purpose. I packed it up, shipped it out, and spent the next few days pretending everything was normal. Then the nightmares started. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced that I heard whispering in my apartment. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision, darting away just before I could focus on them. One night, I thought I heard footsteps outside my window, slow, heavy, like someone pacing back and forth. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. And then the message came. It was unlike any of the others. No recipe, no instructions, just a single image attachment. I almost didn't open it, but my curiosity got the better of me. Like always, it was a photograph of me, sitting in my apartment, staring at my laptop. The timestamp showed it had been taken the night before, while I was reading through the latest client file. There was no way anyone could have gotten that shot. I lived on the 4th floor, and I never opened my windows. I searched the photo, desperate for some sign that it had been edited, but everything about it looked too real. My heartbeat hammered in my chest as I stared at the pixelated glow of my own face on the screen. Beneath the image was a single line of text. "We see you, chef." I shut my laptop, heart racing, and bolted every door and window in my apartment. But sleep was impossible. I kept expecting to hear a knock, or worse, that slow, deliberate creak of the front door opening. My mind replayed the sound of those footsteps outside my window, the shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. But there was no knock, no creak, just that suffocating silence. When morning came, I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined everything. Maybe I was cracking under the pressure, but that spoon, the messages, the photo, those were real. And then, as I stood in front of my kitchen sink, trying to wash away the feeling of dread, I noticed something else, scratched into the metal of the sink, like someone had carved it with a knife, was a new message. "You're ours now." I stared at those words, barely able to breathe. My hands started to shake, and I turned around like I expected to find someone standing there, watching me. But I was alone, the empty apartment pressing in around me like a cage. That was when I realized, no matter how much money they offered, no matter how good I was at cooking their twisted orders, there was no way out. They didn't just want a chef, they wanted me. And I'd already given them more than I'd ever planned to. For days after finding that message scratched into my sink, I couldn't bring myself to even open the emails. I stopped checking my Bitcoin wallet too. Didn't matter how much money they threw my way. I wasn't about to touch another job. I tried to go back to my old routine, work at the diner, come home, sleep. If you can call staring at the ceiling for hours, sleeping. But even as I tried to get back to normal, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My skin prickled every time I stepped outside. It felt like a pair of eyes were following me from across the street, from the shadowy corners of alleyways. Whenever I worked a shift at the diner, I swore I saw unfamiliar cars parked outside, engines idling just a little too long. One night, after closing up the diner, I took a different route home, cutting through a back alley and around a few corners. When I turned onto my street, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Someone was standing in front of my apartment building, just a dark silhouette under the orange glow of the streetlights. I couldn't see their face, but they were turned in my direction, head slightly tilted, like they were studying me. I froze, and for a split second, I considered turning back, but then they just stepped backward into the shadows, disappearing behind the edge of the building without a sound. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just some random guy, maybe a neighbor, maybe someone looking for directions. But deep down, I knew better. I sprinted the rest of the way home, locked the door behind me, and grabbed the heaviest kitchen knife I could find. I spent the whole night sitting on my couch, knife gripped in my sweaty hand, waiting for the door to open, for the footsteps to start again. But nothing happened, just that awful, heavy silence pressing down on me. When the sun finally came up, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to check my email to see if they'd sent any more messages. Maybe I was looking for answers. Maybe I was just hoping it would all somehow stop. But when I logged in, I found a new message with no subject line. And when I opened it, my blood ran cold. It was a video file, no sender, no text, just a timestamp from the night before. Against every ounce of my better judgment, I clicked play. The screen flickered, then settled into a grainy shot of a dimly lit room. It looked like a basement, concrete walls, a single light bulb swinging overhead, casting long shadows, and in the middle of the frame was a chair, an old wooden one, and sitting in it was a man. He looked terrified, pale, with a cloth gag in his mouth, and his hands tied behind his back. His eyes darted wildly around the room, as if he was expecting something to happen. And then a figure stepped into the frame, their face obscured by a shadow. They held up a silver spoon, the same spoon that had been left on my doorstep, and slowly dragged it across the man's cheek. He flinched at the touch, eyes wide with fear. I felt bile rise in my throat, but I couldn't look away. The figure leaned down, whispered something in the man's ear, and he started to struggle, jerking against his restraints, his muffled screams filling the empty room. The figure stepped back, lifting the spoon to their lips as if they were savoring some kind of twisted pleasure in the scene. And then the video cut to black. At the bottom of the email was a single line. "Your next ingredient is ready, chef." I slammed my laptop shut and threw it across the room. My mind raced, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I knew what they were implying. They wanted me to cook again, but this time, it wasn't about some last meal request. They wanted me to use him, the man in the chair, as the secret ingredient. They wanted me to cook something with a piece of his life, like I'd done with my blood. Only this time, it wasn't just a drop in the batter. It was something far darker, far more twisted. I tried to tell myself it was just a sick joke, that maybe the whole thing was fake. But that night, I found another package on my doorstep. A small box, wrapped in that same twine, like the first one. My hand shook as I opened it, half expecting to find something worse. But inside, all there was a single tooth. A human tooth that stained with dried blood. I nearly threw up right there, but I forced myself to look at it. There was a note tucked beneath the tooth, written in neat, small handwriting. "He's waiting for you." That was the moment I realized they weren't just watching me. They were controlling me, pushing me deeper, testing how far I'd go, how much I'd break before I snapped. And I couldn't stop thinking about that man's face, the terror in his eyes, and the way he looked like he was begging for me to help him, even though he didn't know who I was. I didn't want to be a part of this anymore. I tried to go to the police, but when I got to the station, the words died in my throat. What could I even say? Hey, I've been cooking for people on the dark web, and now I think they're making me part of some messed up ritual. They'd think I was crazy, and maybe I was, but I knew enough to realize that these people, whoever they were, had connections. They knew things about me, things no one should know, and they weren't afraid to use that against me. When I got back home, there was another email waiting for me. It just said, "You know what you need to do. Don't disappoint us." I spent that night sitting on my kitchen floor, staring at that tooth, the knife still in my hand, wondering if there was any way out of this. But deep down, I knew there wasn't. I'd already gone too far, made deals with people you don't just walk away from, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, a small, horrible part of me kept thinking about the money, about the way my hands itched to cook again, like I was starting to crave that twisted thrill. But this time, it wasn't just about the food. It was about something else, something I couldn't quite understand, but that felt like it was wrapping around my life, squeezing tighter and tighter. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man in the chair, begging for help that I couldn't give. And that's when the knocking started. Slow, deliberate taps on my front door, just after midnight. The sound echoed through the apartment, sending a chill down my spine. I sat there, paralyzed, clutching the knife. But the knocking didn't stop. It went on for hours, steady and patient, like they knew I wouldn't be able to resist forever. I don't know how much longer I can take this, but I know one thing. They're not going to stop until I give them what they want. And maybe, just maybe, some twisted part of me doesn't want them to. The knocking continued, night after night, always just after midnight. It was relentless, soft but deliberate, like a heartbeat echoing through the walls of my apartment. I'd sit on the other side of the door, knife in hand, trying to convince myself that I wouldn't open it. But that same creeping dread always settled into my bones, whispering that maybe, just maybe, they'd break down the door themselves if I didn't. After about a week, the knocking stopped, replaced by something worse. Silence. I should have felt relieved, but the quiet felt more suffocating, like I was waiting for the next part of the game to start. And then, just when I thought I might be free, they sent me another email. It was different this time. No photos, no videos, no twisted instructions, just an address, a set of coordinates leading to a remote area outside of town, and a message. Pick up the package. You'll know what to do. I thought about ignoring it, but something kept gnawing at me. If I didn't follow through, if I just tried to disappear, I knew they'd find a way to drag me back in. Maybe they'd send another gift, or worse, make good on their threat to hurt someone else. So I gave in. I packed my knife and some cash, just in case, and drove out to the coordinates they'd sent. It was almost dawn by the time I reached the location, an old, abandoned rest stop in the middle of nowhere. There were no cars, no lights, just the rusted shell of a gas station and the skeletal remains of a sign that once read, "Rest Easy." The place looked like it hadn't seen life in years, and yet, there it was, a plain black duffel bag sitting on the ground next to the fuel pumps. I stepped out of my car, the cold morning air biting at my skin, and walked over to the bag. My hands shook as I unzipped it, already half knowing what I'd find inside. But the reality was worse than I could have imagined. Inside the bag, lying on top of a pile of grimy stained towels, was a Polaroid photo. It was the man from the video, the one tied to the chair. Only this time, he wasn't sitting anymore. He was sprawled on a concrete floor, eyes wide open, staring directly into the camera. His mouth was slack, and his skin had taken on that awful pale gray hue that only comes with death. Next to him, someone had scrawled a message in black marker on the wall. "You're up next, chef." I dropped the photo like it had burned me, my mind reeling. But that wasn't the worst part. As I dug deeper into the bag, I found something else. A plastic container, sealed tight, like the kind you'd keep leftovers in. And inside, there was a piece of raw meat. It looked like a chunk of something human. My stomach twisted, and I almost hurled right there in the parking lot. They were giving me a piece of him, expecting me to do what they trained me for. I wanted to drop the whole thing, leave the bag, and drive away. But my mind was racing. What would happen if I didn't follow through? I couldn't shake the thought of the photo, that final, empty stare in his eyes. It was a warning, I realized. This was what they'd do to me if I disobeyed. I could almost feel their eyes on me, watching through the shadows, waiting to see what I'd choose. So I did the only thing I could think of. I took the bag and drove back to my apartment, my thoughts spiraling into darker and darker places the whole way. It felt like I was losing my grip on reality, like the world outside the car window wasn't quite right, blurred around the edges. By the time I got home, I was half convinced I'd see them waiting for me in the hallway, but there was no one there. Once inside, I dumped the contents of the bag onto my kitchen counter and just stared at the mess. The photo, the towels, the plastic container. I tried to tell myself I wouldn't go through with it, that I'd find a way to run, but even as I thought it, I could feel the pull, the same twisted urge that had driven me to put my blood in that batter, to accept their jobs, to step deeper into their world. The smell hit me first, metallic, sour, unmistakably wrong. I forced myself to breathe through my mouth as I unpacked the container, laying the hunk of raw meat on my cutting board. My hands moved on their own, reaching for the kitchen knife, but my mind felt disconnected, like I was watching myself from a distance. I tried to think of it like any other job, any other ingredient, but the lines had blurred too much. I prepped the meat, trying not to think about what or who it had been before. The process felt mechanical, robotic. Dice, season, sear, simmer. I cooked it into a stew, the way I might have for any other client, except this time, there was no order, no instructions beyond, you know what to do. And as the pot bubbled on the stove, the smell of the meat mingling with onions and garlic, I felt that same twisted calm settle over me. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd leave me alone once I finished, that if I gave them what they wanted, they'd let me walk away. But a part of me knew That was just another lie I was telling myself, a way to make it through the horror of what I'd done. When the stew was done, I sat down at my kitchen table, the container of it steaming in front of me. I waited for something to happen, for another message or a knock at the door, but the silence was thick, unbroken. I felt like I was sitting in the eye of a storm, waiting for the winds to pick up again and sweep me away. And that's when I heard it, a soft, muffled sound coming from the hallway outside my apartment. It took me a moment to realize what it was, but when I did, my blood turned to ice. Someone was crying. It was a low, ragged sound, like they were trying to hold it in, but every few seconds, it broke into a small, choked sob. I crept toward the door, pressing my ear against the wood, trying to hear better. But the moment I did, the crying stopped. The air grew thick, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, loud enough to drown out the quiet. And then, a voice. Low, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakably there. "Why did you do it, Chef?" I stumbled back from the door, my legs going weak beneath me. I glanced back toward the kitchen, where the pot of stew still sat on the table, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move across the room, like something had passed between me and the light. I turned on every light in the apartment, clutching the knife so tight my knuckles turned white. But no matter how much I searched, I found nothing. Just empty rooms, empty spaces, and the lingering scent of the stew. But I knew then that it didn't matter. They weren't just messing with me anymore. They'd found a way into my life, into my head, into the darkest parts of me that I hadn't even known were there. And now, I couldn't tell where they ended, and I began. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the knife beside me, waiting for the sun to rise, knowing deep down that this wasn't over, that it was only going to get worse. And somewhere, in the back of my mind, a voice kept whispering that maybe I didn't want it to end, that maybe, just maybe, I wanted to see what would happen if I followed their game to its twisted conclusion. And even as I tried to ignore that voice, it was the only thing that kept me company in the darkness. I barely slept after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear that whisper from the hallway, asking why I did it. But worse than the voice was the feeling that the walls of my apartment were closing in on me. I felt trapped, suffocated, like I was living in a fishbowl, constantly watched from somewhere just out of sight. For the next few days, I tried to act like I was still in control. I even went back to the diner, pretending that I could just pick up where I'd left off. But everything felt off. I couldn't focus. Every time a customer walked in, I'd flinch, half expecting them to know what I'd done, to look me in the eyes and see right through me. And every time I heard the bell above the door chime, I'd feel a cold shiver run through me, convinced that this time it would be one of them. After my shifts, I'd rush back home and check my email, expecting another message, another video, but there was nothing, just that same silence, stretching on and on, making me feel like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to give way. I thought maybe they'd lost interest, that I was free, but part of me knew better. This was just the calm before the storm. It finally broke one night when I found another package on my doorstep, identical to the last. Black box, tied with twine. I almost left it there, hoping it would disappear if I ignored it. But I knew they wouldn't let that happen. My hands were trembling as I brought it inside, feeling like I was dragging something rotten into my home. Inside the box was a phone, a cheap, disposable burner, the kind you'd get at a gas station. It buzzed to life the moment I touched it, a text flashing on the screen before I could even think about smashing it to pieces. Live stream starts at midnight. Don't miss it. I felt my throat close up, my heart hammering in my chest. Midnight was only a few hours away. I tried to think, tried to come up with some way to stop whatever was about to happen. I considered running, throwing the phone into a river, anything to sever the connection between me and them. But I knew it wouldn't matter. Wherever I went, they'd find me. They always did. So I waited, sat in the middle of my darkened apartment, the phone gripped in my hands, watching the minutes tick down. And as the clock struck 12, a new message appeared. Join now. A link followed, directing me to a live stream page. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the phone, but I forced myself to click. The screen went black, then flickered, and an image came into focus. A room lit by a single swinging light bulb, casting shadows that danced across the concrete walls. I recognized it immediately. It was the same basement from the video, but this time the chair wasn't empty. Someone was sitting there, head slumped forward, their face hidden behind a mess of dark, greasy hair. I couldn't see their face, but their body twitched slightly, like they were trying to fight against the ropes that bound them to the chair. And then the camera angle shifted, zooming in on the figure's face. My breath caught in my throat. It was me. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. The person on the screen, tied to the chair, was identical to me. Same scar on the hand, same clothes I was wearing. But I was sitting here, in my apartment, phone in hand, watching this twisted broadcast unfold. I reached up, touching my own face, trying to convince myself that it wasn't possible, that this was just some sick trick, some deep fake or AI manipulation. But the fear in that version of my eyes, was too real, too raw. And then a voice crackled through the stream, distorted but familiar. It's time to cook, chef. I felt like my mind was fracturing, splitting between the person I was watching on the screen and the person sitting here, helpless. The camera panned, showing a small table next to the doppelganger. On it was a knife, a lighter, and a sheet of instructions scrawled on stained paper. The screen blurred, but I could just make out the first line. Carve your ingredient. The figure on the screen looked up, staring directly into the camera, and for the briefest moment, I saw myself, really saw myself, frozen in fear. And then I heard it, that same whisper from before, but this time it came from behind me, so close I could feel the warmth of breath on my ear. Why did you do it, chef? I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the empty apartment, shadows spilling across the floor. My mind whirled as I turned back to the screen, and I realized something horrible. The figure on the screen was crying now, tears streaming down their face. But they were my tears. I reached up and felt the wet streaks on my own cheeks. I was crying, even though I hadn't realized it. The stream went on, the figure in the chair, me, shaking as a hand reached out from the darkness and forced the knife into their grip. And I knew, without a doubt, that whatever was happening to them, I'd feel it too. The boundary between my reality and theirs had shattered, and I was trapped in the in-between. The voice came again, soft but commanding. Finish the meal. I screamed then, throwing the phone across the room, the screen shattering against the wall. The stream cut out, but the damage was done. I felt it, a deep, burning pain searing through my arm. as if the knife from the video had cut into my own flesh. I looked down, expecting to see blood pooling onto the floor, but there was nothing there, just smooth, unbroken skin. But the pain was real. I stumbled to the sink, running cold water over my arm, but it did nothing to dull the agony. And then I heard the phone buzz again from where it lay shattered on the floor. Another message, flashing up through the cracked screen. Next time, don't disappoint us. The pain eased, just enough for me to collapse to the floor, gasping for breath, my mind fraying at the edges. And I knew then, without a doubt, that they weren't just controlling me anymore. They'd found a way to twist reality itself, to trap me between two worlds, each one more horrific than the last. I wish I could say I had some kind of plan, that I'd figured out a way to fight back, to break free. But the truth is, I'm still here, stuck in this limbo, waiting for the next command, the next job. Every time the phone buzzes, I feel that same rush of terror, knowing that I'll pick it up, that I'll follow their orders, because I don't have a choice anymore. I don't know how long I can keep this up, but I know one thing for sure. They're not going to let me go. Not until I finish the meal they started. And maybe when it's all over, when I've done everything they've asked, they'll finally show me who they really are. Or maybe I'll just become another face on that screen, trapped in a place where reality twists and bends, where nothing is what it seems. And if that happens, I can only hope that no one else ever finds that job listing, because once you've let them in, they never let you go. I wish my son was dead. He was kidnapped in 2003. Last night I found him on the dark web, and the next day he knocked on my door. I've never posted on Reddit before, but after last night, I feel like I have no choice. I've heard stories, like the kind people put up on here, stuff that's supposed to be real, but you don't really believe it, right? It's all fiction, something you read for a scare before bed. But this is my life, and I don't know how to make sense of it anymore. Let me start from the beginning. My son Jeremy was kidnapped when he was 6 years old. This was back in 2003, in a small town in Missouri. It was one of those typical summer days. Ice cream trucks rolling down the street, kids riding bikes in the neighborhood. Jeremy was outside playing with his new baseball glove. I told him I'd be inside for a few minutes, but when I came back, he was gone. No screams, no struggle, just gone. I looked everywhere, but deep down, I knew. I knew that feeling parents always dread, but never want to acknowledge. That kind of pit in your stomach that tells you something's gone terribly wrong. We called the police. They issued Amber Alerts. The whole town searched. For weeks, they combed through every creek, every abandoned house. But there was nothing. No leads, no suspects. Just a hole in our lives where my son used to be. After a while, the police stopped looking, the reporters stopped calling, and our neighbors stopped asking. My wife, Samantha, couldn't take it. She moved out a year after. She's remarried now, has kids. But me, I never left that house. I still live in the same place where Jeremy disappeared. Like if I stayed put, somehow he'd find his way back home. For years, I'd go on these deep dives on the internet, looking for anything, even rumors, that could explain what happened. Maybe it was a cult, a trafficking ring, or even some messed up loner who thought they could get away with snatching a kid. But every time, I hit a dead end. Eventually, I started trying to move on, or at least pretend I had. But then, last night happened. Part 2. The dark web rabbit hole. I've always known about the dark web. I mean, I'm no tech genius, but when you spend years looking for answers, you start poking around in places you shouldn't. I'd never actually visited it myself until last night. It was around 2 a.m., and I couldn't sleep, like usual, so I fired up my laptop. I don't know what drove me to do it, but I finally decided to download Tor and see if there was anything out there about missing kids. Maybe even Jeremy. It's not like I expected to find anything, but I guess I hoped, you know. I stumbled onto this forum called Silhouettes. Just the name gave me chills, but I figured I'd scroll through it anyway. It was mostly weird conspiracy stuff. Pictures of abandoned buildings, old hospital files. Nothing that really caught my attention. But then I saw a thread titled, "Where Lost Things Go." It didn't look like much, just a link to a video stream. The comments were sparse and cryptic. Stuff like, "Don't watch if you know what's good for you," or "This is where nightmares start." But curiosity got the better of me. I clicked on the link. The stream opened to a dimly lit room. The quality was low, grainy, but I could make out some details. The walls were stained, covered in scratches, almost like claw marks, and there was a chair in the middle of the room. A figure was tied to it, their face obscured by a burlap sack. I should have closed the tab right there, but then I heard something, a muffled voice. It sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. I turned up the volume and leaned closer to the screen. That's when I heard the figure say, "Dad." I froze. My heart was pounding, and my mouth went dry. It sounded just like Jeremy, but that was impossible. It's been 21 years. Jeremy would be 27 now, not some kid tied to a chair. But then, the figure started to cry, softly, the way Jeremy used to when he was scared. And I don't know why, but I typed into the chat box below the stream, "Who is this?" The video feed flickered, like the camera was glitching, and then I saw a new message pop up on the screen. "You wished for this, didn't you?" Part 3. The Knock. I don't know how long I stared at that screen, trying to make sense of it. My mind kept racing, telling me it was some sick joke, a prank meant to mess with people like me who still hold on to hope. But deep down, I felt like I was being watched, like whoever was running that stream knew me. And then, as if on cue, the feed cut to black. A few seconds later, my screen went blue, and my laptop powered off. I tried to turn it back on, but it was like the whole thing had short-circuited. I just sat there, in the dark, with only the sound of my own breathing. It was then I heard the knock. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I mean, it was nearly 3 a.m., and no one ever visits me. But the knocking continued, soft and slow, like the person on the other side had all the time in the world. I went to the front door, and for a second, I just stood there, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like opening that door would change everything. Like once I did, there was no going back, but I had to know. So, I took a deep breath and swung the door open, and there he was, Jeremy, my son, or at least someone who looked like him. He was older, obviously, but his face, it was like he hadn't aged a day since 2003. Same bright blue eyes, same messy brown hair. He was even wearing the same red hoodie he had on when he disappeared. The only difference was his skin. It looked pale, almost waxy, like he'd never seen the sun. "Hi, Dad," he said, smiling. But it wasn't a real smile. It was stretched too wide, his lips cracked at the edges. I took a step back, my legs barely holding me up. I wanted to say something, to ask where he'd been, but all I could manage was, "How?" He tilted his head, like he was considering the question. "You wished for me to come back, didn't you?" he whispered. And then his smile widened even more, exposing teeth that were far too sharp, far too white. I slammed the door shut and locked it, backing away like a coward. I could hear him outside, still knocking, still calling my name, but I just slid down the wall and buried my face in my hands. I sat like that until morning. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door again, there was nothing on my porch except a single Polaroid photo. It was a picture of Jeremy, tied to that chair in the room from the video stream, his face hidden under the burlap sack. But this time, there was a new message scrawled on the back in jagged handwriting. "You should have let him go." I can't explain what's happening. I don't know if this is really my son or something pretending to be him, but I can still hear the knocking outside, even now, and it's getting harder to ignore. I haven't slept. I haven't eaten. I just keep staring at the door, waiting for it to stop, or for him to break it down. After that first night, I thought I was losing my mind. I told myself it was a dream, some messed up, grief-induced hallucination. But then, when I checked my porch the next morning, that Polaroid was still there. The image of Jeremy tied to that chair, his face hidden under the burlap sack, stared back at me. My hand shook as I turned it over, reading the message again. "You should have let him go." I tried to convince myself that someone had broken in, planted that photo to mess with me. But why? And how could they have known about Jeremy? Nobody around here even talks about him anymore. Most people in town think I'm the weird guy who never moved on. Maybe I am. I locked myself in the house, double-checking every door, every window. I even barricaded the back door with a chair. The whole time, I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. Outside, everything looked normal. Birds chirped. The sun was out. Just another quiet day in a quiet neighborhood. But all I could think about was that knock on my door, those sharp teeth behind Jeremy's smile. Around noon, I decided to dig through the box of old VHS tapes I kept in the attic. It's stupid, I know, but I thought maybe there was something I'd missed. Some video of Jeremy playing, a sound I'd forgotten. Maybe I just wanted to remind myself that he'd once been real, that he hadn't always been a nightmare standing on my front porch. I found an old camcorder and a stack of tapes, most of them labeled with Jeremy's name and my wife's neat handwriting. I settled on the living room floor, plugged in the camcorder, and started watching. There were birthday parties, Christmas mornings, just the usual family stuff. But then I reached a tape I didn't recognize. The label had been scratched out, and something about it made my stomach twist. I pressed play. The screen was static for a moment, and then the footage flickered into view. It was my living room, but from a strange angle, like the camera had been hidden behind the curtains. It showed me, back in 2003, sitting on the couch, talking on the phone, probably with the police, reporting Jeremy missing. My breath caught in my throat. I don't remember anyone being in the house then, let alone filming me. But that wasn't even the worst part. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was a figure standing just out of sight. They were wearing a burlap sack over their head, just like in the stream. The video was too grainy to make out any details, but they were watching me, listening, and then the camera shifted, slowly, like whoever was holding it wanted to make sure I saw them. The figure raised a hand, long fingers splayed out, and waved. I shut off the tape, nearly throwing the camcorder across the room. My mind was spinning. That footage couldn't have been there before. I'd watched all of those tapes 1,000 times, looking for any hint of where Jeremy might have gone, but I'd never seen that before. Someone must have put it there recently, but who? I tried calling the police, but as soon as they picked up, I realized how insane I'd sound. Hey, I found a video of a stranger in my house from 20 years ago, and I think my dead son is alive. Yeah, right. They chalk it up to grief and send me away. Part 3. The message. By the time evening came, I was a wreck. I tried eating, but couldn't keep anything down. I kept glancing out the front window, expecting to see Jeremy, or whatever that thing was, standing there again. But the yard stayed empty, and that almost made it worse. It was like waiting for a bomb to go off. I checked my email out of habit, hoping for some distraction, but there was a new message from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Let him go." My hand hovered over the mouse, hesitating, but curiosity got the better of me, like it always does. I clicked. The email contained a single video file, no text, no explanation. I double-clicked it and immediately regretted it. It was that same room from the stream, dimly lit with a chair in the center. But this time, the camera was much closer, zoomed in on the figure tied up. I could see the burlap sack moving slightly, like he was breathing underneath. There was a noise in the background, something like humming, but distorted, like a broken lullaby. A voice crackled through the speakers. It was low, guttural, not quite human. "He's been waiting for you," it rasped, the words echoing like they were coming from a tunnel. "Why did you abandon him?" The camera zoomed in further, focusing on the figure's hands. They were small, pale, the fingers twitching. One of the hands had a scar across the knuckles, something I remembered Jeremy getting from falling off his bike when he was 5. My stomach turned. I closed the laptop, slamming it shut, but the video kept playing, the sound somehow bleeding through the closed device. I grabbed it and threw it across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud, and the humming finally stopped. The room went silent, but I could still hear that voice in my head. "Why did you abandon him?" The words felt like they were scratching at my brain, trying to crawl their way in. Part 4. Midnight Visitor. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat in the corner of the living room, clutching an old baseball bat, like that could protect me from whatever was out there. But by the time midnight rolled around, I realized the knocking had started again. This time, it wasn't on the front door. It was coming from the window, slow and deliberate, like whoever, or whatever, was out there wanted me to know they had all night. I glanced toward the window, and in the dim light, I saw a shape pressed against the glass. It was Jeremy's face, or at least what used to be his face. His skin looked even paler now, stretched too tight over his skull, his eyes wide and unblinking. He was staring straight at me, mouth twisted into that same awful smile. "Dad, let me in," he whispered through the glass, but his voice sounded distorted, like it was coming from an old tape recording. "It's cold out here." My grip on the bat tightened, and for a second, I almost considered letting him in. I mean, what if it really was Jeremy? What if he'd been hurt, changed somehow, but was still my son? But then I remembered that voice from the video, the way it mocked me. I took a step back, shaking my head. "You're not him," I muttered, more to myself than anything. His smile faltered, just a little, and then, without another word, he turned and walked back into the darkness. But as he did, I noticed something on the ground where he'd been standing, a small bundle wrapped in a dirty cloth. When I finally worked up the nerve to go outside, I found a cassette tape inside the bundle, the kind you'd find in an old answering machine. Written on it in black marker were the words, "Listen, Dad, I don't know what to do. I don't know if I can bring myself to play that tape. But part of me knows that whatever happens next, I can't avoid it anymore." Something came back to my house that night, and whether it's my son or something wearing his skin, I think it's only just begun. It took me hours to work up the courage to listen to that cassette tape. I kept pacing around the living room, the tape just sitting there on the coffee table, staring at me like it knew I'd have to play it eventually. I thought about throwing it out, smashing it to pieces, but I knew that wouldn't change anything. Whoever, or whatever, was doing this wouldn't just stop because I ignored it. Finally, I found my old tape player in a box in the basement, covered in dust. It hadn't worked in years, but somehow, when I popped in the cassette, it clicked into place, like it had been waiting for this moment. My hands were shaking as I pressed play. At first, all I heard was static, that kind of old-school white noise that makes your skin crawl. But then, a voice crackled through, muffled, like it was struggling to break through some kind of interference. And it wasn't just any voice, it was mine. "Jeremy, if you can hear this, I'm sorry," my own voice whispered through the speaker. "I should have protected you. I should have been there." I felt my legs go weak, and I dropped to my knees beside the tape player. I had no memory of ever recording something like this, but the voice kept going, and it sounded so much like me, like the desperation I'd felt back then, like it had been bottled up and trapped inside that cassette. The voice paused, and then another sound crept through. It was soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but then it grew louder, clearer. A child sobbing, the kind that's all hiccups and gasping breaths, like they're trying to hold it together, but can't anymore. It took me a second to realize that it was Jeremy's voice, the same way he'd sounded when he'd wake up from nightmares and come running into my room. "Dad?" Jeremy's voice cracked, barely a whisper. "Dad, where are you?" I clamped my hands over my mouth, trying to keep from making any noise, but the tears were already streaming down my face. The tape continued, his voice getting more frantic, more panicked. "It's dark, Dad. I don't know where I am. I'm scared." His words cut off suddenly, like someone had hit pause, and the tape fell silent for a moment. But then, the same low, guttural voice from the stream crackled through, layered over the static. "He's waiting for you," it said, its tone mocking. "Why did you leave him here?" I felt a chill run down my spine, and my whole body went cold. My mind was racing, trying to piece it together. Was this some sick joke, some twisted game? But how could anyone know the things on that tape? The way I'd begged for answers back then, the sound of Jeremy's voice. It was too perfect, too real. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, I heard something else in the background of the tape. A soft shuffling sound, like footsteps dragging over a wooden floor. It got closer, louder, until it almost drowned out everything else. And then the voice, my voice, spoke again, but this time it wasn't whispering. "Don't open the door." The tape clicked and the sound cut off, leaving me alone in the silence of my living room. I have always thought that fear was supposed to come in waves, that you'd get a moment to breathe between the terror. But that night, fear wasn't a wave. It was an ocean, pulling me under, dragging me deeper every second. As the sun dipped behind the trees and the shadows bled into the house, I realized just how trapped I was. The thing outside, Whether it was Jeremy or something pretending to be him, wasn't going to leave until I made a choice. Let him go or bring him home. The words looped in my head like a song I couldn't forget, each time making me question what they meant. Let him go. Did that mean giving up, moving on? Or was it a threat? Some kind of twisted reminder that I should have given up looking for him years ago. By nightfall, I found myself pacing around the living room, clutching that baseball bat like it was my only lifeline. The windows seemed darker than usual, as if the night outside was thicker, pressing up against the glass. I kept glancing at the door, expecting to hear that awful knocking again, but this time it was quiet, too quiet. And then, right around midnight, I heard it, a faint noise, like a child crying. It was coming from the basement. I froze. I hadn't gone down there in years. It was just full of old furniture, boxes of memories I couldn't bring myself to throw away. But now, the sound of that crying, weak and broken, drifted up through the floorboards. I knew it was a trap. I knew whatever was down there wasn't really Jeremy, but I couldn't help myself. What if I was wrong? What if he'd been here this whole time, just waiting for me to find him? I grabbed a flashlight, my hands trembling, and crept down the basement stairs. The air grew colder with every step until I could see my breath puffing out in front of me. The crying got louder, filling the small space, echoing off the cement walls. But as I reached the bottom, the flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with it, smacking it against my palm, but it wouldn't turn back on. The crying stopped, replaced by that same awful humming I'd heard in the tape, a slow droning tune that crawled under my skin. I forced myself to stay calm, to focus on where the sound was coming from. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I saw a shadowy shape crouched in the far corner of the basement. "Jeremy?" I whispered, my voice cracking. It felt stupid to say it out loud, but I couldn't stop myself. "Is that you?" The shape shifted, uncurling from its hunched position. For a second, I thought I saw Jeremy's face in the shadows, those same bright blue eyes staring back at me. But then, the thing rose to its full height, and I realized it was far too tall, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, bending in ways they shouldn't. "Dad," it said, but it wasn't Jeremy's voice. It was the distorted, double-layered voice from the tape, the one that mocked me, taunted me, the voice that wasn't human. "You never should have looked for me." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over an old box, my heart slamming against my ribs. The thing took a step forward, its head tilting to one side, jerking like a puppet on strings. And as it moved into the dim light from the stairwell, I saw its face shift. One moment it looked like Jeremy's, young and scared, and the next it was a twisted, hollow version, the skin sagging off the bone, eyes too large, too empty. It reached out a hand toward me, long fingers stretching out like claws. "You can still bring him back," it said, and the voice softened, just for a moment. It almost sounded like my real son. "But you have to choose, Dad." I turned and ran up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me, locking it tight. My heart was hammering in my chest, my mind racing. The crying had stopped, but now there was a new sound, a steady thumping, like something heavy was hitting the basement door from the other side. Part 5. A mother's voice. Just when I thought I'd reached my breaking point, the landline phone rang. The old one that had been in the house since the 90s, the one I kept plugged in out of habit. My whole body jerked at the sound, and I almost didn't answer it. But then I thought, what if it was the police, or someone who could help me? I picked up the receiver, and at first all I heard was static crackling through the line, and then faintly a voice broke through. My ex-wife, Samantha. "Paul?" She sounded confused, her voice shaky. "Paul, are you there?" "Samantha," I whispered, clutching the phone like it was my only lifeline. Why are you calling?" She hesitated, and in the background I could hear a strange, echoing noise, like wind rushing through a tunnel. "I got a call earlier. I thought it was a prank, but it sounded like Jeremy. He said you were in trouble, that he needed you." My blood ran cold. She couldn't know what was happening. She hadn't spoken to me in years, and she sure as hell hadn't known I was trying to find Jeremy again. But there was something in her voice, something that sounded like real fear. "Samantha, listen to me," I said, my voice barely more than a rasp. "Whatever you do, don't come here. Don't try to help. It's not him. It's not our son." There was a pause, and I heard her take a shaky breath. "Paul, what are you talking about? Are you okay? I think we need to call someone." The line went dead, cutting off in a burst of static. And then, through the receiver, I heard that same voice, the one from the basement, the one that shouldn't exist. "She can't help you now," it whispered. "No one can." I dropped the phone, backing away from the wall, my mind unraveling. The thumping from the basement had stopped, but now there was a new sound coming from outside. It was a soft scraping, like someone dragging their nails across the siding of the house. I turned, glancing out the window, and my heart nearly stopped. The thing outside was back, standing in the yard, its head tilted at that unnatural angle. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, shadowy figures moved, shuffling across the lawn, their bodies flickering in and out of focus like a bad signal, and all of them had burlap sacks over their heads, just like in the video. They moved closer, their footsteps crunching on the gravel, but no matter how close they got, I couldn't make out their faces. It was like the darkness was wrapped around them, twisting their shapes into something almost human, but not quite. The figure that looked like Jeremy raised a hand, and the others stopped. It pointed at the front door, and for a second, everything went still. Then, all at once, they started to whisper, their voices overlapping, hissing through the gaps in the windows. "Let him go. Bring him home. Let him go. Bring him home." I stumbled back, covering my ears, but the voices didn't stop. They kept whispering, growing louder, until I thought my head might split open. And then, in the midst of all that noise, Jeremy's voice cut through, clear and broken. "Dad, please. It's so dark. I want to come home." I fell to my knees, clutching my head, torn between the voice that begged me to save him and the voice that warned me to stay away. But deep down, I knew there was no choice left. Not really. If I opened that door, I might never see the real Jeremy again. But if I didn't, I looked toward the front door, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The whispers outside grew softer, fading into a low, rhythmic hum, like they were waiting for me to decide. And just as I reached out for the doorknob, my hand trembling, a final thought crossed my mind, colder than the night outside. What if I was the one who needed to be let go? The whispers outside grew quieter, blending into the hum of the night until they felt like the pulse of the darkness itself. My fingers hovered over the doorknob, the cold metal biting into my skin. I couldn't shake the feeling that opening that door would change everything, that once I crossed that threshold, there'd be no going back. But then, I heard it again, Jeremy's voice, small and broken, like it had been when he was a kid after a bad dream. "Dad, please, don't leave me here." The sound hit me like a punch to the gut. It was exactly how he'd sounded the night he went missing, when he begged me to let him sleep in my bed because he was scared of the dark. I'd told him he was too old for that, told him he needed to face his fears, and then, the next morning, he was gone. A part of me wondered if this was my punishment, my penance for not being there when he needed me most. But I had to believe that somewhere, deep inside this twisted nightmare, my real son was still waiting, that if I opened the door, I could bring him home. I took a deep breath, turned the lock, and swung the door open. The cold hit me first, a blast of air that smelled of damp earth and rot. The front yard stretched out in front of me, and in the glow of the porch light, I could see them, those shadowy figures with burlap sacks over their heads. They stood in a circle around the house, their bodies unnaturally still, like mannequins waiting for instructions. In the middle of the circle stood the figure that looked like Jeremy. He was closer now, so close that I could see the pale skin stretched tight over his face, the sharpness of his 2 white teeth as he smiled. "Thank you, Dad," he said, and this time there was no distortion in his voice. It was soft, almost sweet, like the real Jeremy's voice. But something about the way he smiled, how his eyes glittered in the darkness, made my skin crawl. I just want my son back," I stammered, my voice barely more than a breath. "Please, let him go. If you can hear me, Jeremy, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't protect you." The figure tilted its head, considering my words, and for a brief, desperate moment, I thought I saw a flicker of sadness in his expression. But then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and black, a Polaroid photo. He held it up for me to see, letting it flutter down to the porch. My hand shook as I bent down to pick it up, the edges crinkling between my fingers. The image was blurry, like it had been taken in a rush, but I could still make out what it showed. A boy standing alone in a dark room, his face obscured by shadow. Written on the bottom, in that same jagged handwriting, were the words, "Only one of you can come home." The figure that looked like Jeremy took a step closer, his bare feet crunching on the gravel. "It's your choice, Dad," he whispered, leaning in close enough that I could feel his breath, cold and sweet, against my face. "Let me in, or leave him with us." I glanced back down at the Polaroid, at the boy trapped in the shadows, and felt my heart twist. I didn't know if it was really Jeremy, if he was trapped somewhere, or if this was just another trick, but I could feel the weight of his voice, his fear, like a knife in my chest. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, my voice barely steady. "If he's still out there, I'll find him. And if you're lying, if this is some sick game..." The figure's smile faltered, just for a moment, and then he let out a low, rasping laugh. It sounded almost human, but not quite, like he was mimicking how laughter should sound. "Very well," he said, and the words slithered into my ears. "But know this, Paul, you can't hide from what's waiting in the dark. You should have let him go." He stepped back into the shadows, his body melting into the dark like smoke. And then, just like that, the figures behind him disappeared too, fading into the night until there was nothing left but the empty yard and the soft rustling of the wind. The air around me felt lighter, less oppressive, like the weight that had been pressing down on the house had lifted. I stood on the porch, clutching the Polaroid to my chest, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My head was spinning, my body exhausted, but I couldn't bring myself to go back inside. Instead, I collapsed onto the porch steps, staring out into the darkness, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Part 6. The Aftermath. The sun came up, casting long shadows across the yard. The figures were gone, but their presence lingered, like a bad dream that clung to the edges of my mind. I must have sat there for hours, my thoughts tangled, trying to decide if any of it had been real. But when I finally went back inside, I found a new Polaroid lying on the kitchen table. It hadn't been there when I'd left, and the sight of it made my heart lurch. I picked it up with trembling hands. This one showed my own front porch, the door wide open, and in the shadows just beyond the threshold, a figure stood, tall, thin, its face hidden in the darkness. But I knew it wasn't Jeremy this time. I could feel its presence through the photo, cold and wrong, like the thing I'd seen in the basement. There was a message scrawled at the bottom, written in the same jagged script. "We'll be waiting." I dropped the photo, my stomach churning, and backed away. My mind screamed at me to run, to leave this place, and never look back. But I couldn't do it. Not yet. I had to believe that somewhere, Jeremy was still out there, waiting for me. That night, I boarded up the windows and the front door, nailing planks of wood over every opening. I found an old crowbar and kept it close by, like that would be enough to protect me from whatever was lurking outside. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. I stayed awake until the early hours, listening for any sound, footsteps, whispers, anything that would tell me they were coming back. But all I heard was the creak of the house settling, the distant hum of the wind outside. And for the first time in weeks, I thought maybe I'd won, maybe I'd made the right choice. But then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it again, soft, almost polite, a knock on the front door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I knew better than to answer it, but the sound kept coming, steady and patient, like whoever was out there had all the time in the world. My hands shook as I clutched the crowbar, my eyes locked on the boarded-up door. And then, through the cracks in the wood, I heard a voice that sounded so much like Jeremy's. "Dad, please, it's so cold out here." I closed my eyes, squeezing them shut, trying to block out the sound, but no matter how hard I tried, the knocking didn't stop, and neither did his voice. "Dad, please let me in. I don't know how long I can keep ignoring it. I don't know if I'll have the strength to hold out, or if one night I'll finally give in and tear down the boards and open the door. Maybe that's what they're counting on. Maybe that's what they've been waiting for all along. But for now, I'll stay here, in the dark, listening to my son's voice calling to me through the walls, and I'll try to remember that sometimes the things we wish for are better left in the shadows. Because the worst part, the part that keeps me awake long after the knocking fades, is that some small, desperate part of me still hopes that it really is him, and that if I open that door, I'll finally get to bring him home. I am a psychiatrist on the dark web. I think one of my patients accidentally confessed to murder. Hey, Reddit. So, this is my first time posting here, and honestly, I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, let alone sharing it online. I've always been more of a lurker, reading your creepy experiences late at night when I can't sleep. But what I've been dealing with lately, I need to get it off my chest, and I figured if anyone would understand, it's you all. A little background on me. I'm a licensed psychiatrist. I've been in the field for about 10 years, dealing with everything from anxiety and depression to more severe cases like schizophrenia and dissociative identity disorder. But about a year ago, I found myself in a bit of a rough spot. Personal issues, a messy divorce, and then the pandemic hit. You know how it goes. My practice took a nosedive, and I had to find a way to keep myself afloat. That's when I discovered the dark web. Now, before you judge, it's not as bad as it sounds. It's not like I was selling drugs or hiring hitmen or anything like that. I just set up a little encrypted chat service where I offered my therapy sessions anonymously. Think of it as a more private version of those therapy apps you see advertised everywhere. But, well, darker. A lot of people are too afraid or paranoid to reach out through normal channels, and I figured I could do some good while making some cash on the side. It's surprisingly common for therapists to use these underground channels. There's even a bit of a community around it. I thought I had seen and heard it all over the years, but a few months ago, I took on a client who changed everything. He reached out to me under the username MURK_rabbit. Now, most people on the dark web use weird, edgy names, so I didn't think much of it at the time. He paid for a month's worth of sessions up front. Bitcoin, of course. We had our first session the following evening. I remember how odd he sounded right from the beginning. His voice was scratchy, almost as if he was whispering through an old rotary phone. He wouldn't share much about himself. No name, no age, nothing. But again, that's kind of the norm with these clients, so I went along with it. Our early sessions were, honestly, uneventful. He seemed like your average paranoid type, rambling about how the government was tracking him, how his neighbors were spying on him, through his webcam, the usual stuff. It's the kind of thing you can hear anywhere on the internet. But over time, the conversation started to take a darker turn. It began with small things. He'd mention how he felt a darkness inside him, that he thought he was capable of things he didn't even want to think about. I'm trained to spot warning signs, like when someone might be a danger to themselves or others. But with him, it was always vague, like he was testing me, trying to see how far he could push before I got spooked. And I won't lie, sometimes I got the feeling he wasn't alone when we spoke. There'd be these strange pauses in the conversation, like he was listening to someone else in the room. Then, one night, he told me something that's been eating away at me ever since. I remember that session clearly, every word of it, like it's been burned into my mind. He sounded different that night, anxious, almost out of breath. He started talking about a dream he'd had. In the dream, he was in a house, but not his own. It was one of those run-down places with peeling wallpaper and broken floorboards. He described walking through the dark halls, feeling like he wasn't alone. And then, I found her, he said. His voice dropped to a whisper. I asked him what he meant, and there was this long pause. So long that I thought the connection might have dropped. But then he continued. She was in the tub. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't breathing. There was this smell, like iron. I froze. The way he described it was so specific, so vivid, it didn't sound like a dream at all. I tried to keep my voice steady, professional. I asked him if he wanted to talk more about the dream, maybe explore what it might mean. He laughed, this dry, humorless chuckle that made my skin crawl. It's not a dream, Doc. That's why it's been bothering me so much. I remember feeling this chill run down my spine, I'd never had a client sound so sincere and scared. I pushed a little, asking him what he meant, and that's when he clammed up, said he didn't want to talk about it anymore and disconnected. Now I know what you're thinking. Maybe he's just messing with me, right? It wouldn't be the first time I had a client try to shock me with some wild story, but there was something in his voice that night, a kind of raw fear that didn't seem like an act, and honestly, it got under my skin. I've had trouble sleeping since then, thinking about that conversation, but it didn't end there. In the following sessions, he acted like nothing had happened. He went back to his usual paranoid rants, like our previous talk never even occurred. It was so bizarre, and I didn't know how to bring it up without spooking him even more. But every time he logged off, I'd find myself staring at my screen, my mind racing. What did he mean it wasn't a dream? Was he confessing something without saying it outright? And then, last week, he dropped off the radar. He didn't show up for our scheduled sessions, didn't respond to my encrypted messages. He just vanished. That's when I started digging, looking through some of the forums where people like him hang out, trying to find any trace of him. And that's when I stumbled across a post that made my blood run cold. It was a local news story, buried under all the usual clickbait. A woman had been found dead in her bathtub in a house not far from where I knew this client was based. He let slip his general area during one of our earlier sessions. The police were calling it a possible homicide, but they didn't have any suspects yet. I can't get it out of my head, the way he described that a dream, the way he seemed to know too much. And now he's disappeared, right after someone fitting his description vanished off the face of the earth. I keep telling myself it's just a coincidence, that there's no way he's connected. But the more I think about it, the more I'm starting to feel like I'm in over my head. There's a part of me that wants to go to the authorities, but I have no proof. It's all encrypted, anonymous, and if they find out I've been offering therapy through illegal channels, I could lose my license, or worse. But then there's another part of me that can't shake this feeling, like I'm somehow tied up in something I don't fully understand. I don't know what to do, and honestly, I'm scared. If any of you have advice, or if you think I'm just being paranoid, I'd appreciate it. I've seen enough true crime documentaries to know how these things can spiral, and I don't want to become part of one. Should I try to forget all this and move on, or do you think he was telling me something more? After that last session, I couldn't stop thinking about him, about Merc_Rabbit and his chilling words. I tried to push the thoughts away, telling myself that it was just another troubled client with a vivid imagination. But every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that rundown house he described, smell that metallic tang of iron he mentioned. It was like a dark cloud hovering over me, day and night. And the news story, God, that story, I kept reading it over and over, trying to find something that would disconnect it from what he had told me, but instead, it only made things worse. There were details in that report that seemed too close to what he described. They found the woman in a small, dilapidated house, one that had been empty for years. She was discovered in the bathtub, and though the police kept most of the information under wraps, they mentioned blood in the water, just like he'd said. But here's the thing that really got me. The article said there were no signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone else had been there. The door had been locked from the inside. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a story. It felt real, like a confession hidden between the lines. And the worst part was, I'd started to feel like someone was watching me. It started small, like little things you could easily brush off. I'd hear what sounded like footsteps outside my house late at night. But when I'd check, no one was there. I live in a fairly quiet neighborhood. People mind their own business, and I rarely see anyone walking around after dark. So hearing footsteps at 2 a.m. in my driveway, it didn't sit right with me. But I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just a stray cat, or my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, it felt like something or someone was out there waiting. Then about 3 days after he disappeared, I found an envelope in my mailbox. No return address, no stamps, just my name written in this shaky, uneven handwriting. My first thought was that it had to be a prank, or maybe just some junk mail from a local kid. But when I opened it, I found a single photograph inside. It was blurry, like it had been taken from a distance, but I recognized what it was immediately. It was my office building, taken at night, with the light still on. The angle suggested it was taken from across the street, maybe from a parked car or someone standing in the shadows. My heart dropped into my stomach. The photo was new too. My car was parked out front, and I swear I hadn't stayed late at the office since I'd started those dark web sessions. So whoever took it must have been watching me, following me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some troll from one of those forums, someone who figured out I was offering sessions on the dark web and thought it would be funny to mess with me. But as much as I tried to believe that, my mind kept drifting back to MURK_rabbit. His cryptic way of speaking, the eerie sense that he knew more than he let on. And now, he was missing, right after he confessed to seeing that woman in the bathtub. For the next few days, I was on edge constantly. I installed security cameras around my house, changed my locks, and even considered moving, just to get away from this feeling of dread that wouldn't leave me alone. But then, one night, something happened that made everything worse. It was around midnight, and I'd just finished reviewing some patient notes, trying to distract myself from everything that had been happening. I was about to head to bed when my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number, one that wasn't saved in my contacts. Just seeing it made my heart skip a beat. I opened the message, and my blood ran cold. All it said was, "You should have listened." I stared at those words for what felt like an eternity. It had to be him, MURK_rabbit. But how did he get my number? Our sessions were always through encrypted channels, and I was meticulous about keeping my personal information hidden. I hadn't even told him my real name. It didn't make any sense. I tried to respond, asking who it was, but the message bounced back. Number not in service. It was like whoever sent it had used a burner phone and then trashed it right after sending the message. I barely slept that night. Every noise, every creak of the house made me jump. I kept staring at the shadows in the corners of my room, half expecting to see someone standing there. But as unnerving as that was, it was what happened the following morning that truly broke me. I woke up to find another envelope on my front porch, just like the last one. No address, just my name scrawled on the front. This time, my hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside was another photograph, but this one was different. It was taken from inside my office. My desk was in the frame, and there, right in the center, was my laptop, still open to the chat window from my last session with MURKRABBIT. I hadn't left my office unlocked. No one else had keys. I checked the building's security footage, but the cameras outside my office had mysteriously cut out between 2:14 and 2:26 a.m., the exact window when the photo must have been taken. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, like a vice clamping around my lungs. Someone had been inside. Someone knew. I don't know how much time passed as I stood there, staring at that photo, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a prank. Someone was trying to send me a message, and whatever it wasn't good. I decided to reach out to the local police, but without any solid evidence, I knew they wouldn't take me seriously. What was I going to say? That I thought one of my anonymous patients might have committed a murder, and that now he, or someone else, was watching me. It sounded crazy, even to me, but I had to try. I called the non-emergency line, and a tired-sounding officer took down my statement, promising they'd look into the break-in. But as soon as I hung up, I had the sinking feeling that I'd just made everything worse. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the flickering shadows on my ceiling, I got another message. This time, it came directly through the dark web chat platform, a username I didn't recognize. Cleaner 666. I opened it, half expecting another cryptic threat, but what I saw instead was a single word, repeated over and over, filling the entire message window. Run. I stared at that word until my vision blurred, my breath catching in my throat. Someone else knew. But was this a warning or a trap? I shut my laptop, turned out the lights, and tried to steady my breathing. But deep down, I knew that whatever this was, it wasn't over. And in the silence of my room, I thought I heard the faintest sound, like footsteps crunching through gravel, just outside my window. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, clutching the nearest heavy object I could find, a metal flashlight, and sat in the corner of my living room, where I had a clear view of both the front door and the window. Every few minutes, I'd check the security camera feeds on my phone, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, just a dark, empty street and the faint glow of the porch light. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that there was no way he, or whoever was doing this, would come to my house. But that message, run, had gotten under my skin in a way I couldn't shake. By morning, my nerves were fried. I couldn't keep going like this, so I decided to take matters into my own hands. I'd spent enough time lurking in those dark web forums to know how to dig a little deeper, find out where my messages might be coming from. I didn't have high hopes, but I figured it was worth a shot. I started with the message from Cleaner 666. There was something off about that username. It felt deliberate, like whoever sent it wanted me to think they were cleaning up something or someone. I managed to trace the message back through several layers of encryption, and finally, I hit a dead end on an old chat room that seemed to be filled with users trading. Well, let's just say odd jobs. It was mostly mundane stuff, but a few posts caught my eye, written in the same disjointed style as Merc Rabbit's messages. They were riddled with typos, strange phrases, like tying up loose threads and tidying the mess. But the most disturbing post was a short, cryptic message that made my skin crawl. Sometimes, the mind has to be silenced before the mouth opens. Who watches the listener? There were no replies, no likes, nothing. It was just sitting there, like bait, in a forum where people traded in secrets. I knew I was getting in too deep, but I couldn't stop myself. I posted a message of my own, something simple. Looking for Merc_Rabbit. Urgent. Have information. I didn't expect much, but it was all I could think to do. I closed my laptop, telling myself I'd only check it again in a few hours, but I barely had time to walk away before I heard the soft chime of a new message. My heart leapt into my throat. When I reopened the laptop, there was a reply waiting for me. No username, no trace of where it had come from, just another message in all caps. Too late. It was like a punch to the gut. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. What did they mean, too late? Too late for what? My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to type out a response, asking what they meant. But before I could hit send, the chat window glitched and then shut down completely. My first instinct was to check my cameras again, to see if anyone was lurking outside. And that's when I saw it. One of the cameras at the side of my house, the one covering the alley, had gone dark. Just a blank screen where the feed should have been. I felt that familiar chill crawling up my spine, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. It was broad daylight, and yet I was afraid to look outside, but I had to. I grabbed my flashlight, trying to ignore how ridiculous it felt to be carrying it in the middle of the day, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cold, unnaturally so, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees just in my yard. My breath fogged up in front of me as I made my way to the side of the house where the camera had gone dark. There, dangling by a cut wire, was the camera. It looked like it had been ripped clean out of its mount, but that's not what made me freeze. Stuck to the side of my house, right where the camera used to be, was a note, scrawled in that same shaky, uneven handwriting. "Why are you still here?" I stumbled back, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I tore the note down, crumpling it in my fist, and ran back inside, locking the door behind me. I was panicking, but I tried to think logically. I grabbed my phone and dialed the non-emergency police line again, my voice shaking as I explained that someone had been on my property, that they'd tampered with my security cameras. The officer on the other end sounded bored, like I was wasting his time, but he agreed to send a patrol car by later in the afternoon. I knew that meant nothing. Whoever was doing this, they knew how to avoid being seen. I spent the rest of the day glued to the window, watching for any sign of movement outside. I barely ate, barely moved, just sat there, waiting for the police to show up. When they finally arrived, it was late afternoon, and the sun was already dipping behind the trees. A young officer knocked on my door, probably fresh out of the academy. He looked around the property, saw the cut camera, and took my statement with all the enthusiasm of a teenager doing their homework. "Probably just kids messing around," he said, flashing me a tired smile. "Halloween's coming up, and you know how it is." I didn't even bother arguing with him. I just nodded, forcing a polite smile, and watched him drive away, knowing he wouldn't lose a second of sleep over this. That night, I didn't bother trying to sleep. I kept my flashlight in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other, the laptop open in front of me, refreshing the forums every few minutes, hoping for a new message. Around 3 a.m., I finally got one. It was from an anonymous account, and this time, the message was different. It was short, just a single question. "Did you hear the knocking?" As soon as I read it, I froze. I hadn't heard anything. No knocks, no sounds outside. But just as I was about to close the laptop, there it was, a slow, deliberate knock on my front door. 3 knocks, each one echoing through the empty house. I turned off the lights, my heart hammering in my chest. I crept to the front door, careful not to make a sound, and peered through the peephole. I expected to see someone standing there, a shadowy figure, a man in a hoodie, something, but there was no one, just the empty street, the glow of the porch light illuminating the steps. But as I turned away from the door, my phone buzzed again. Another message, this one just as cryptic as the last. You should answer. He hates waiting. I almost dropped my phone. I didn't know what to do. Call the police again and sound like a lunatic? Open the door and see who or what was out there. I knew I couldn't just stand there paralyzed with fear, but every part of my brain was screaming that something was horribly wrong. The knocking came again. 3 more knocks, slow and deliberate. It sounded closer this time, like it wasn't even coming from the door anymore, but from inside the walls, right next to me. I couldn't take it. I threw open the door, ready to confront whoever was out there. But the porch was empty. The street was silent. There was no one there. But just as I was about to shut the door, I saw something lying on the welcome mat. It was a burner phone, cheap and scratched up, like the kind you'd buy at a gas station. The screen was lit up, showing a single unread message. With shaking hands, I picked it up and read it. "You're not listening, Doc." And that's when I heard it. A whisper, so close it felt like it was right against my ear. So quiet I could barely make out the words. "You need to stop looking." I spun around, my flashlight swinging wildly, but there was no one there. Just the cold October wind and the empty street, stretching out like a dark ribbon in front of my house. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly, utterly alone. After that night, I stopped sleeping entirely. It wasn't like I had a choice. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear those knocks again. Sometimes on the walls, sometimes on the windows, sometimes so faint it felt like they were coming from inside my own head. I took to pacing around the house, checking every lock, every window, like I was expecting someone to slip in through the cracks. But I knew, deep down, that whoever or whatever this was, they wouldn't be stopped by something as simple as a lock. The burner phone I found on my porch, it kept lighting up with messages, each one worse than the last. I tried ignoring them at first, but it was like trying to ignore a splinter that kept digging deeper. My hands would shake as I picked it up, reading the messages in the dark, my stomach turning with every new notification. Most of them were short, disjointed sentences, stuff that didn't make sense, but had a way of gnawing at my nerves. "He is watching. The darkness knows. Silence means you're next." But one message, about a week after the last knock, finally pushed me over the edge. It was a photograph, taken from inside my house. It showed me, asleep in my bed, the blankets pulled tight around me, my face pale and slack with exhaustion, and in the corner of the frame, just barely visible in the shadows, was a figure, tall and thin, with a face blurred out like a glitch in a video file. I dropped the phone, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might explode. I tore through the house, checking every room, every closet, but there was no one. And when I checked the time the photo was sent, it didn't make sense. It said 3:33 a.m., right around when I'd been pacing the living room. I hadn't been in bed. I don't think I've ever felt so powerless. Someone had been in my house taking photos of me, and I hadn't even known. They'd left without a trace, slipping in and out like a shadow. I thought about going to the police again, but what was I going to show them? A blurry photo and a bunch of cryptic messages from a burner phone. They'd just write me off as paranoid, or worse, think I was some kind of danger to myself. I needed answers, and the only place I thought I might find them was in the forums where I first connected with the Merc_rabbit. So I went back in, digging through threads, trying to find anything that might connect to him. But the deeper I went, the weirder things got. It was like the whole place had changed overnight. Threads that had been active for years suddenly vanished. Usernames I recognized had all gone silent, and new users, ones I didn't recognize, were posting cryptic warnings, saying things like, "Don't talk about the rabbit," and "Some doors should stay shut." There was this sense of unease that clung to every message, like everyone there knew something I didn't. And then, in one of the deepest corners of the site, buried in a thread titled Lost Sessions, I found a post from someone calling themselves Gateway_13. The post was simple, just a few lines. Sometimes they find a way back through the listener. You have to end the sessions. If you don't, it'll never stop. Below the post, there was an encrypted link. I hesitated. Every instinct in me screamed that this was a bad idea, but I clicked on it. The link took me to a dark page, almost entirely blank, except for a single message in the center of the screen. "Do you want to hear the truth? Confirm your choice." Two options appeared, yes and no. My finger hovered over no for a long time, but then I thought about that photo, about the figure lurking in the corner, and I clicked yes. The page glitched out for a second like a bad TV signal before a new message appeared. They used to call them rabbit holes. Sometimes you dig too deep. You let something in. That's what he is. He's not alone. Below that message, there was a distorted audio file labeled simply Confession. I didn't know what I expected, but I had to hear it. I clicked play, and a voice crackled to life through my speakers, low, wheezing breaths, like someone struggling to speak. It was MURK_rabbit. I recognized that scratchy tone immediately, but he sounded different, like he was in pain, or maybe scared. And in between those ragged breaths, he started speaking. I didn't mean to. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I just wanted to tell someone, to get it out of my head. But then, he found me. He found me because of you, Doc. You weren't supposed to listen. You weren't supposed to see him. There was a long, wheezing pause, like he was fighting for air, and then he whispered something that sent a chill straight through my spine. They call him the listener. He comes through the whispers, through the dark places. I didn't know. He's using you now, Doc. He's using you to listen for him. The audio cut out, replaced by a harsh static that made my ears ring. I ripped off my headphones, my mind reeling. This was insane. It had to be some elaborate prank, some kind of dark web role-playing game. But as I stared at the screen, another message popped up, like someone was typing directly to me. "Did you hear him too?" I slammed the laptop shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind was a whirl of thoughts. None of it made any sense. How could some entity, or whatever Merc_rabbit was talking about, actually be real? But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something beyond any rational explanation. That night, I barricaded myself in my bedroom, stacking furniture against the door, like I could somehow keep whatever was out there away. But when I finally drifted off into a restless sleep, I had a dream. Or maybe it was something more. I was back in my office, but everything was wrong. The air was thick and heavy, like breathing through a wet cloth, and the shadows seemed to bend and stretch unnaturally. And then I saw him, a tall, gaunt figure, standing at the far end of the room, half hidden in the shadows. His face was a blur, a mess of static, like someone had taken an eraser to his features, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and empty. He reached out with one long, bony hand, and even though I couldn't see his mouth, I knew he was smiling. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like a drum, and when I glanced at the clock, it read 3:33 a.m., the same time as that photo, the same time as the knocks. But this time, I didn't hear anything, just silence, so deep it made my ears ring. I grabbed the burner phone from my bedside table, praying I wouldn't see any new messages, but there it was, one final text, waiting for me. "You're too late, Doc. He's already inside." I dropped the phone, backing away like it might burn me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but it felt like I was drowning in darkness, like something was wrapping itself around my thoughts, squeezing tighter and tighter. That was the last message I got. The phone went dark after that. No more texts, no more photos. But I knew it wasn't over. It was just beginning. And somewhere outside, just beyond the edge of the porch light, I swear I could hear it again. That faint, rhythmic knocking, like something tapping against the walls, waiting to be let in. I tried to convince myself it was my mind playing tricks on me, that all of this was just stress, sleep deprivation, paranoia, anything but the truth that had been creeping closer, night after night. But no amount of logic could change the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel it, like an itch in the back of my mind, this presence that seemed to linger just beyond my sight, just beyond the edge of my thoughts. For days, I barely left my house. The locks and cameras became my new obsession, but I knew they were just a flimsy barrier against whatever was out there, or worse, whatever was already in. I stopped checking the burner phone, stopped logging into the dark web, but the knocks kept coming, always at 3:33 a.m., always in that same rhythm, 3 slow, deliberate taps, like a heartbeat in the dark. And then, 2 nights ago, the power went out. I'd been sitting in my living room, staring blankly at the glow of the TV, when everything just cut out. Lights, heat, even the dull hum of the fridge. The darkness swallowed the house in an instant, so complete it felt like I'd been plunged underwater. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow path through the black, but every shadow seemed to stretch and twist, bending in ways that didn't feel right. The knock came again, 3 slow taps, but this time they weren't at the door. They were inside, somewhere deep in the walls. I tried to tell myself it was just the old pipes, the wood settling in the cold, but I knew better. My whole body was on edge, every nerve screaming that I needed to leave, that whatever I'd let into my life was too close now, too real, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they'd been filled with cement, locking me in place. That's when I heard the whisper. It wasn't like before, not the faint, distant murmurs from the dreams or the messages. This was right behind me, so close I could feel the chill of breath against the back of my neck. "You're the one who listened, Doc. Now it's your turn to speak." I spun around, swinging the flashlight wildly, the beam slicing through the dark. But there was no one there, just the empty room, my own ragged breathing filling the silence. But that voice, it lingered, echoing through my skull like a broken record. Then the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into total darkness. And that's when I heard the footsteps, soft, deliberate, pacing just beyond the edge of my vision, circling me. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, my breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. I stumbled backward, crashing into a table, sending a glass shattering across the floor. But the footsteps never wavered, never rushed, just kept that steady, taunting rhythm, as if mocking my fear. In desperation, I fumbled for my phone, using the screen's pale glow to light up the room. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped it, but as the light swept across the shadows, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the window. A figure, tall and gaunt, with a face that seemed to ripple and blur like a glitch in reality. And then, the reflection turned its head, like it was looking right at me, even though there was no one in the room. I ran. I don't even remember grabbing my keys or throwing open the door. I just remember the cold air hitting my face as I stumbled out into the night, barefoot, my breath clouding in front of me. I didn't care where I went, just as long as it was away from that house, away from whatever had taken root inside. I ended up driving, not knowing where I was going until I found myself in the parking lot of an old motel on the edge of town. I paid cash for the room, barely registering the bored clerk's expression as I grabbed the key and locked myself inside. It felt safer here, anonymous, hidden, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even as I double-checked every lock and wedged a chair under the doorknob. That night, I dreamed again, but this time, I wasn't in my office. I was in that run-down house Merc_Rabbit had described. The wallpaper was peeling, the floorboards creaked under my weight, and the air smelled like rust and decay. I knew what I'd find before I even reached the bathroom, but my legs carried me there anyway, like I was moving through molasses. The tub was filled with dark water, the surface slick with something oily and wrong. And there, just beneath the waterline, was a face, blurred, twisted, like someone screaming in a place where sound couldn't reach. But it wasn't Merc_Rabbit. It was me. I woke up choking on my own breath, the taste of iron thick on my tongue. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, lighting up the dark room. It was a message from a number I didn't recognize. Another burner, probably. End the sessions, Oregon. They will end you. I dropped the phone like it had burned me. It felt like a noose tightening around my neck, pulling me deeper into something I couldn't escape. But as I sat there, shaking and gasping for air, I realized something. There was one last thing I hadn't tried. I had to go back to the beginning, to the last place where I still had some control, to that final abandoned chat with Merc_Rabbit. If there was any way to end this, it had to be there. I logged in through a borrowed laptop, the motel's Wi-Fi flickering as I connected to that dark web chat. The familiar cold interface blinked to life, but the screen was empty, just my own messages, hanging there like a ghost town. I typed out a message, not even sure who I was talking to anymore. I'm here. What do you want? For a long time, there was nothing. I could hear the motel's ancient heating unit rattling in the corner, the faint hum of a vending machine in the hallway. And then the screen flashed and a new message appeared, but it wasn't from Merc_Rabbit. The username was different, something I'd never seen before. Listener 0, it said, "Welcome back." I felt a shiver run down my spine, cold as ice, as the words continued to appear, one by one. "He wants to speak with you." My hands hovered over the keyboard, my mind racing. I knew I should disconnect, close the laptop, burn everything to the ground if I had to. But some part of me, a part I hated, needed to know. I needed to hear whatever it was that had been haunting me, following me through the dark. So, I typed back, the words barely visible through my shaking fingers. "Who is he?" The reply came instantly, faster than any human could have typed. "The one you let in, the one you can't unsee. He is in the walls, the wires, the spaces between thoughts." I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as the screen flickered, lines of code and static crackling across the display, forming a distorted image, a face warped and twisted, eyes like black voids staring back at me from the screen. And then the power in the motel cut out, plunging the room into pitch black. But this time, I didn't hear any knocks. I heard the sound of breathing right behind me. I don't remember much after that, just the feeling of something cold and thin wrapping around my throat, pulling me back into the dark. I think I blacked out, because when I woke up, the sun was rising, casting thin rays of light through the dirty motel blinds. My throat was raw, my head pounding like it had been split open, but I was alone. The laptop was still on, but the chat window was gone, wiped clean like it had never been there. The only proof that any of it happened was the burner phone on the nightstand, its screen cracked and dark. I don't know how long I sat there, just staring at the blank screen, trying to piece together what was real and what was a nightmare. But I know one thing for sure. Whatever I let in, whatever I listened to, it's not going away. Not unless I do what the message said. I have to end it. I'm going back to my office today to destroy the laptop, the chat logs, everything. I don't know if it'll work, but I don't think I have much time left. The knocks have started again, louder now, like they're inside my head. If you're reading this, take my advice. Stay away from the dark corners of the web. Don't listen too closely to the things that whisper from the shadows, because sometimes when you listen too long, something listens back, and once it does, it won't stop until it's found a way in.